I am Olivia, 33 years old. On my 27th birthday, I caught my husband in bed with my best friend. Tonight at my cousin's lavish wedding, he cornered me by the bar, smirking as he looked me up and down. He told me that leaving me was the best decision he ever made. Before I could even respond, a 5-year-old boy ran through the crowd and threw his arms around my legs, yelling that he loved me. My ex-husband laughed, calling me a desperate single mother. But then a man stepped up behind me, adjusted his luxury watch, and delivered a single sentence that made the blood drain entirely from my ex-husband's face. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the pain while plotting the perfect payback against those who wronged you. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the soft hum of a live jazz quartet filled the grand ballroom of the Newport Country Club. My cousin was pulling out all the stops for her summer wedding, and the room was a sea of designer gowns, tailored tuxedos, and forced high society smiles. I stood near the edge of the mahogany bar, holding a simple glass of sparkling water with a twist of lime. I wore a minimalist, understated charcoal slip dress. It was elegant, but compared to the sequined monstrosities surrounding me, I suppose it looked remarkably plain. I was enjoying a rare moment of quiet when a familiar, suffocating scent of expensive cologne assaulted my senses. I turned to see Bradley, my ex-husband, leaning against the polished wood of the bar. He looked exactly the same as he did 6 years ago, still possessing that arrogant, practiced charm that had once fooled me completely. He held a glass of scotch, the amber liquid catching the light from the chandeliers above. He looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my unadorned neck and the simple cut of my dress, his lips curled into a cruel, knowing smirk. "Leaving you was the best decision I ever made," Bradley said, his voice loud enough to turn the heads of a few nearby guests. 6 years and you are still attending family events alone in a discount dress. I almost feel sorry for you. Before I could formulate a reply, a woman materialized at his side, slipping her arm through his with exaggerated possessiveness. It was Natalie, my former best friend, and the woman who had happily destroyed my marriage. She wore a dress dripping in heavy beads that probably cost more than a luxury car. She raised her left hand to brush a non-existent lock of hair from her face, making absolutely sure the massive flashing diamond ring on her finger caught the light. "Oh, Bradley, leave her alone," Natalie crooned, though her eyes danced with malicious delight. "It cannot be easy for Olivia to see how far we have come. Not everyone is cut out for the kind of success we have built. Look at her, she has not changed a bit. Still so terribly plain." I did not cry. I did not flinch. I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing any emotional reaction whatsoever. I simply took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water, letting the cool liquid wash down my throat while I maintained steady, unbroken eye contact with the man who had shattered my world in my 20s. I knew exactly who they were, and I knew exactly what they had built their lives on. It was a house of cards financed by borrowed money and lies. Just as Bradley opened his mouth to deliver another insult, a blur of motion broke through the crowd of well-dressed adults. A 5-year-old boy wearing a tiny, perfectly tailored tuxedo that mirrored his father's sprinted across the polished dance floor. His face was lit up with pure, unadulterated joy. He crashed into me, wrapping his little arms tightly around my legs. "Mommy," Leo squealed, burying his face in the fabric of my dress. "I found you. I love you, Mommy." I set my glass down on the bar and ran my hand through his soft curls, a genuine smile finally breaking across my face. Bradley and Natalie froze, staring at the child clinging to me. The cruel amusement on their faces quickly morphed into a toxic mix of shock and fresh ammunition. Bradley let out a sharp, barking laugh that grated against the elegant background music. "Well, well, well," he sneered, shaking his head. "I guess you finally managed to get pregnant. Who is the unlucky guy? Or did you just go to a clinic because you were so desperate to lock someone down? Look at you, a desperate single mother bringing her baggage to a sophisticated evening. How completely pathetic." Natalie giggled, leaning her head against Bradley's shoulder. It is actually incredibly sad. Imagine having to drag your kid to a wedding because you cannot get a date. I felt a sudden familiar warmth at my back before I even saw him. A large, reassuring hand rested gently on the small of my back, the touch immediately grounding me. Dominic stepped up beside me, his physical presence instantly commanding the space around us. He was impeccably dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that subtly matched my dress, and he possessed a quiet, dangerous kind of authority that made people instinctively step out of his way. He reached up with his free hand and casually adjusted the cuff of his shirt, exposing the heavy, unmistakable gleam of a platinum Rolex. He bypassed the petty social posturing entirely and looked straight at Bradley with eyes as cold as winter ice. "Tech Frontier Developments, right?" Dominic asked, his tone mild, almost conversational. "Very interesting. My firm acquired your primary lender early this morning." Bradley stared at Dominic, the arrogant smirk wiped clean from his face. His mind scrambled. Tech Frontier Developments was his identity, a precarious house of cards built on massive loans and aggressive leveraging. If Dominic's firm controlled his primary lender, Bradley's financial life rested in his hands. Before Bradley could defend himself, a sharp, familiar voice sliced through the jazz music. "Patricia." My mother descended upon our circle like a bird of prey. She wore an emerald gown, her hair sprayed into a stiff helmet. She did not look at me. She did not look at the man holding my waist. Her eyes darted straight to 5-year-old Leo, still happily clutching my dress, unaware of the tension. "I specifically told you that children were discouraged at the evening reception." Patricia hissed, her tone low but laced with absolute venom. "This is a sophisticated event. The bride paid $300 a plate, and you bring a loud child to disrupt the cocktail hour. You always find a way to make things difficult." I smoothed Leo's hair and told him to grab a mini quiche from the catering tray nearby. He scampered off, oblivious to the toxic energy radiating from his grandmother. Patricia finally looked up, but her gaze bypassed me entirely. Her harsh expression melted into a manufactured smile as she turned toward my ex-husband. "Bradley, darling," she cooed, grasping his arm with genuine affection. "It is wonderful to see you tonight. You look absolutely dashing. And Natalie, that dress is stunning. You two are the picture of success." It was a classic Patricia move. For 6 years, she maintained a warm relationship with the man who cheated on her daughter simply because Bradley projected the illusion of old money she so desperately craved. In her eyes, my divorce was my own fault for not keeping a successful man happy. Patricia turned her attention to Dominic. She looked him up and down, eyes narrowing critically as she assessed his unbranded charcoal suit. Because Dominic did not wear flashy logos, my mother immediately categorized him as beneath her social standing. "And who is this?" Patricia asked, waving a manicured hand in Dominic's direction. "Olivia, if you hired a nanny for the evening, he should wait in the children's area down the hall. Or did you actually bring him as a date? Please tell me you are not dating the hired help. We have a reputation to maintain tonight." I felt Dominic's hand tighten slightly on my waist, delivering a silent message of solidarity. He did not look offended. He looked thoroughly amused. Before I could explain who Dominic was, a booming laugh echoed behind my mother. "Look at this little reunion," a loud voice declared. Kendrick, my younger sister's husband, swaggered into our circle. He wore a crushing velvet blazer in a loud burgundy shade, paired with a heavy gold chain over a black turtleneck. Kendrick loved to project wealth. He was a self-proclaimed crypto wealth manager, constantly talking about aggressive yields and digital market disruption. He stood next to Bradley, clapping him firmly on the shoulder. "Brad, my man," Kendrick said loudly, ensuring everyone could hear his booming voice. "I just finalized the wire transfer for our new commercial block. The partnership is locked in. We are going to double our returns by the fourth quarter." Kendrick turned his attention to me, offering an exaggerated, pitying smile. "Olivia, still hanging around the edges, I see." He looked at Dominic, letting out a condescending chuckle. "And who is your quiet friend? He looks like an accountant. Let me give you some free advice, buddy. You will never get ahead wearing off the rack suits and playing it safe. You have to take risks." I moved my entire portfolio into decentralized digital assets last year. Now I am financing Bradley's commercial developments. We are playing in the big leagues. Kendrick took a large gulp of his champagne, clearly thrilled with his own monologue. Patricia beamed with pride, gesturing toward Kendrick and Bradley. "This is what real ambition looks like, Olivia," my mother stated, her voice dripping with disappointment. "Kendrick and Bradley are building an empire. They understand how the world works. You could learn a lot from them instead of associating with people who have zero drive." Dominic finally shifted his stance. He released my waist, took a single deliberate step forward, and looked directly into Kendrick's eyes. The mild amusement in his expression vanished entirely, replaced by the clinical dissecting gaze of a predator observing its prey. "Decentralized digital assets," Dominic repeated smoothly. "That is a very creative way to describe funneling unregulated funds through the Cayman Islands." Kendrick's smug smile faltered slightly. "Excuse me." Dominic slid his hands into his pockets, his tone remaining perfectly conversational and quiet. "You use the Azure Trust Shell Corporation to bypass domestic capital gains taxes. You bounce the crypto yields through a server farm in Malta before depositing them directly into Bradley's domestic LLC to wash the origin of the funds. It is a classic, somewhat sloppy integration phase of money laundering." The silence that fell over our small circle was absolute. Even the background jazz music seemed to completely fade away. Patricia looked highly confused, but the color was rapidly draining from Kendrick's face. "I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about," Kendrick stammered, his voice suddenly lacking its previous volume. "You really should," Dominic replied, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "Because the federal auditors officially flagged the Azure Trust Network 3 days ago. My firm was consulted on the asset seizure protocols. I have to admit, using your father-in-law's residential address as the primary guarantor for an illegal offshore tax haven is certainly a bold choice. I applaud your bravery for dodging federal audit so openly." The delicate crystal champagne flute slipped from Kendrick's trembling fingers. It hit the polished mahogany floor with a sharp, violent crack, shattering into dozens of pieces. The crash of Kendrick's glass shattering against the floor silenced the area. Guests stared at the spilled champagne. Kendrick stood paralyzed, staring at Dominic. Before Kendrick could scramble for an excuse, the heavy oak doors to the reception hall swung open. A brass bell chimed, signaling the dinner service. Patricia seized the opportunity to deflect the awkward tension. She clapped her hands sharply, herding the guests toward the grand entrance. She ushered Bradley and Natalie forward like royalty. Kendrick followed, pulling a pale Diana along. I held Leo's hand and stepped forward. Patricia blocked my path. She shoved a flimsy place card against my chest. She pointed toward the far back corner. She stated my seating assignment was table 42. Dominic guided us through the decorated tables. We walked past the towering centerpieces of the VIP section. Bradley, Natalie, Kendrick, and Diana sat at table 1 adjacent to the bride. They laughed, ordering immediate drink refills. We walked past extended family and coworkers. We finally arrived at table 42. It sat against the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. Every time a waiter rushed out, the doors slammed back, sending hot air over our seats. The table wobbled slightly. It was an overflow table hastily assembled with a wrinkled tablecloth. I sat down smoothly, helping Leo into his chair. Dominic sat beside me, glancing at the kitchen doors with a neutral expression. He wedged a spare napkin under the uneven table leg to stop the wobbling. He looked at me, a silent promise in his eyes that this night was not over. 10 minutes later, the room quieted as the sweating catering manager took the microphone. He cleared his throat nervously, wiping his forehead. He apologized profusely, explaining that due to a financial shortfall from the bride's father, the venue had to make immediate adjustments. The premium dinner service was downgraded to a basic chicken plate, and the open bar was entirely suspended. All alcoholic beverages would now require direct cash or card payment at the bar. A wave of annoyed groans rolled through the ballroom. Wealthy guests muttered their displeasure, offended at opening their own wallets at a high society event. Natalie's voice cut through the murmurs, loud and deliberately projected to carry all the way to the back. She stood up from the VIP table, holding her empty flute. She sighed, digging into her designer purse. She announced that it was a tragedy to attend a wedding that ran out of money. She turned around, locking eyes with me across the room. She shouted over the noise, asking if I needed to borrow a $20 bill. She mocked me, suggesting that since I was sitting by the kitchen, I could probably wash a few dishes to pay for a cheap beer. She laughed loudly, noting that a single cocktail might completely break my grocery budget as a single mother. Bradley smirked, leaning back in his chair and watching me with intense satisfaction. He believed I was entirely humiliated, pinned to the back of the room, and exposed as a financial failure in front of our family. I did not react to her taunts. I calmly stood up from the wobbly table. I patted Leo's head, told Dominic I would be right back, and walked with measured steps across the ballroom. I bypassed the VIP table, entirely ignoring Natalie's triumphant sneer. I walked directly up to the main bar, where the catering manager was trying to calm a group of angry guests. I bypassed the complaining crowd and stepped up to the manager. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a solid rectangle of black titanium. I placed my American Express Centurion card face down on the polished marble bar. I did not raise my voice. I spoke to the manager in a calm, authoritative tone. I instructed him to immediately reinstate the top-tier open bar for all 200 guests. I told him to scrap the basic chicken plates and upgrade the entire room to the original Wagyu steak menu. I explicitly authorized him to charge the entire difference plus a 20% gratuity for his highly stressed staff directly to my card. The manager stared at the heavy black metal card, then looked up at me with wide, shocked eyes. He recognized exactly what kind of financial power that specific piece of titanium represented. He quickly grabbed a portable payment terminal, swiped the card, and watched as the staggering transaction amount was approved instantly, without a single secondary check. He handed the card back to me with shaking hands, bowing his head slightly in profound respect. I slipped it back into my clutch, gave him a polite nod, and turned back toward my seat. The manager practically sprinted back to the stage, grabbing the microphone with vibrant energy. He tapped it twice, instantly silencing the grumbling crowd. He joyfully announced that a massive mistake had been made. He declared that a highly generous VIP guest had just personally covered the venue's entire financial deficit. He told the cheering crowd that the premium open bar was back in full effect, and the Wagyu steak service would commence immediately. The ballroom erupted into genuine applause and excited cheers. Bradley immediately stood up from the VIP table. He buttoned his suit jacket, pasting a humble, magnanimous smile across his face. He waved his hand gently toward the clapping guests, soaking in the admiration, fully ready to accept the credit and falsely cement his status as the wealthy savior of the family wedding. The catering manager shook his head violently. He leaned into the microphone, his voice booming over the speakers. He stated clearly that the gentleman at table 1 had absolutely nothing to do with the upgrade. He extended his arm, pointing directly past Bradley, past the VIP section, straight to the back of the room. He pointed exactly at me as I gracefully sat back down at the wobbly table by the kitchen doors. The applause was still ringing in my ears as I excused myself. I needed a moment of quiet away from the glaring lights. The plush carpets muffled my footsteps as I made my way down the gilded corridor toward the powder room. It was an opulent space lined with marble counters and full-length mirrors. I walked to the sink, turning the brass handle. The cold water felt refreshing. I took a deep breath, looking at my reflection. I felt completely in control. The heavy oak door behind me swung open with a violent thud that echoed sharply against the marble walls. Natalie stormed into the room. Her face was flushed red, contrasting horribly with her heavily beaded designer dress. She locked the door behind her with a sharp click, ensuring no other guests could interrupt us. Her chest heaved as she marched toward me, her eyes burning with pure, unadulterated rage. She looked nothing like the polished socialite she pretended to be in the ballroom. She looked like a cornered animal. "Do you think you are so clever?" Natalie hissed, stopping inches from where I stood. "Throwing your money around out there, humiliating Bradley in front of everyone. You always had to make everything about yourself." I reached for a thick linen hand towel, drying my fingers with slow, deliberate motions. I did not look at her, keeping my gaze fixed on my own reflection in the mirror. I simply paid for a dinner service that the host could not afford Natalie. If Bradley feels humiliated by a steak that is a reflection of his own insecurities, not mine. Natalie scoffed, slamming her heavily ringed hand onto the marble counter. Stop playing the innocent victim. You have been waiting for a moment like this for 6 years. You are just bitter because I took him from you. She leaned closer, dropping her voice into a venomous whisper. You want the truth, Olivia? I never even liked Bradley back then, but he promised me a life of absolute luxury. He promised me the penthouses, the cars, the status. Things you took for granted. You were so boring, so obsessed with your little career. You did not deserve that lifestyle. I did. I tossed the linen towel into the brass basket. The sheer audacity of her admission did not shock me. It only confirmed what I had known for years. She had traded her best friend for a bank account, completely unaware that the account was built on quicksand. You sold your soul for a luxury illusion, I said calmly, finally turning to face her. Tell me, Natalie, how are you enjoying the spoils of your victory? How is that magnificent new mansion in the Hamptons? Natalie instantly stood taller. The mention of the property was exactly the ego boost she needed to regain her footing. A smug, triumphant smile spread across her face. It is breathtaking, she bragged, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. 10,000 square feet of pure custom architecture. We just closed on it last month. It has a private infinity pool overlooking the ocean, imported Italian marble in every bathroom, and a wine cellar that Bradley is currently stocking with vintage Bordeaux. We are hosting a massive summer gala there next weekend. The entire country club elite will be attending. It is a level of wealth you could only dream of reaching with your tragic little crisis management firm. I let her finish her boast. I watched her revel in the fantasy she had constructed for herself. I waited for a beat of absolute silence to settle in the marble room. It sounds truly spectacular, I replied softly, tilting my head. There is just one minor problem. Natalie crossed her arms, her diamond ring catching the harsh vanity lights. Oh, really? And what would that be? That property does not belong to you. I stated, my tone devoid of any emotion. It is a short-term corporate rental. It is owned by a private equity group that specifically stages high-end properties for investment brochures. Natalie let out a harsh, dismissive laugh. You are completely insane. We have the deed. We paid cash. You have a forged intent to purchase agreement, I corrected her smoothly. Bradley leased the property for exactly 45 days. He rented expensive prop furniture to fill the rooms. He is using the house as a physical backdrop to convince high-net-worth individuals that his development company has vast liquid assets. It is a classic real estate staging scam designed to lure in desperate investors before his actual creditors force him into bankruptcy. Once the 45-day lease expires next Tuesday, the real owners are changing the locks. You are not hosting a gala, Natalie. You are going to be trespassing. Natalie's face went completely slack. The arrogant smirk vanished, replaced by a hollow look of absolute panic as she desperately tried to calculate the reality of my words. Before Natalie could utter a single word of denial, the door to the last bathroom stall swung open. My younger sister Diana stepped out. Her face was ashen, her breathing shallow and erratic. She gripped the edge of the stall door so tightly, her knuckles were pure white. She had heard every single word. A rental! Diana choked out, her voice trembling violently as she stared at Natalie with wide, horrified eyes. You said you bought it. Kendrick told us Bradley needed immediate liquid capital to close the deal on that exact property to bypass a bidding war. Natalie took a stumbling step backward, suddenly unable to speak. Diana turned her frantic gaze to me, tears instantly welling in her eyes. Olivia, she whispered, her voice breaking completely. Kendrick wired Mom and Dad's entire retirement savings to Bradley last month. He took all of it. He promised them a 20% return when the Hamptons property flipped. If Bradley does not actually own that house, where is our parents' money? Diana stumbled backward, her pale, shaking hands tightly clutching the edge of the cold, hard marble sink. Her breathing grew shallow and rapid as the reality of my words crashed into her. Kendrick, her arrogant husband, had not just made a risky investment. He had actively stolen our parents' entire retirement nest egg and handed it over to a man who was renting luxury furniture to fake his net worth. Natalie stood frozen, her heavily beaded gown suddenly looking like cheap armor. She could not formulate a single word of defense. I reached out and gently placed my hand on Diana's trembling shoulder. I told her that she needed to find Kendrick immediately and demand a full accounting of every cent he had transferred. Diana did not hesitate. She turned on her heel and bolted out of the restroom, leaving the heavy oak door swinging in her wake. I looked back at Natalie, who was now staring at her own reflection with a dawning sense of sheer terror. I calmly adjusted my dress, picked up my clutch, and walked out to rejoin the reception. The atmosphere in this grand ballroom had shifted entirely. The previously annoyed guests were now thoroughly enjoying the premium steak and exclusive champagne I had silently financed. The live jazz quartet played a lively tune and the room buzzed with festive energy. I navigated back to table 40 where Dominic and Leo were quietly waiting. Dominic pulled out my chair, his eyes scanning my face to ensure I was all right. I gave him a small, reassuring nod, just as the sharp ringing of a spoon against crystal cut through the music. I looked toward the head table. The best man had been standing with the microphone ready to deliver his speech, but Bradley had smoothly intercepted him. Bradley stood at the center of the dance floor holding the microphone with the practiced ease of a seasoned salesman. He offered a charming, utterly fake smile to the bride and groom, offering them a brief, generic congratulation before seamlessly pivoting the attention entirely back to himself. Bradley announced that since he was surrounded by so many esteemed friends, family members, and successful entrepreneurs, he wanted to share a monumental opportunity. He began pitching his new development project right there on the dance floor. He described a sprawling, ultra-luxury residential community that would revolutionize the local real estate market. He casually mentioned that he was opening up a limited, exclusive secondary funding round tonight. He urged the wealthy guests in the room to speak with him before the evening ended to secure their equity in the project. He promised guaranteed massive returns within 12 months. My mother clapped enthusiastically from her seat, her eyes shining with blind pride. Dominic calmly placed his napkin on the table. He stood up, smoothing his tailored jacket. He did not rush or raise his voice, but his physical presence immediately commanded the attention of the room. He walked directly toward the audiovisual control table, positioned near the edge of the stage. The young technician working the soundboard looked up, intimidated by Dominic's cold, authoritative demeanor. Dominic casually pulled his smartphone from his pocket and instructed the technician to mirror his screen to the massive projector behind the head table, which had been previously used for a slideshow of the bride and groom. The technician complied instantly. The massive white screen flickered to life. Bradley stopped speaking, his charismatic smile faltering as he turned to look at the screen. Dominic took a few steps forward, addressing Bradley in a mild conversational tone that somehow carried perfectly across the silent ballroom. He praised Bradley's pitch, calling it a masterclass in aggressive marketing. He noted that massive returns were incredibly appealing to any smart investor. However, Dominic continued standard due diligence, required a basic verification of assets before any capital changed hands. Dominic tapped his phone screen deliberately. The giant projector instantly displayed the official state government public registry database. Dominic's thumb swiped smoothly across his illuminated phone screen, pulling up the exact legal land deed for the Apex Ridge development site. The document was magnified for all 200 guests to see clearly. Dominic asked Bradley to point out his name or his development company on the official property deed. Bradley's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. He gripped the microphone tightly, his knuckles turning white. Bradley let out a condescending laugh, attempting to brush off the interruption. He told the crowd that real estate at this level was complex. He confidently stated that his name was not on the deed for liability purposes. He declared that the land was legally owned by Nova Holdings LLC, which was simply his private holding corporation. He told Dominic to sit down and stop embarrassing himself. Dominic did not sit down. He did not flinch. He simply tapped his screen twice more. The projector image shifted seamlessly from the property deed to the state corporate commission filings for Nova Holdings LLC. Dominic enlarged the text, bringing the corporate officers section into sharp, undeniable focus. He calmly informed Bradley that establishing a holding company was indeed a smart business move, but lying to potential investors about owning it constituted federal wire fraud. The corporate documents on the massive screen were crystal clear. Bradley's name did not appear anywhere in the filing. The registered paperwork listed a single individual as the sole chief executive officer and absolute majority shareholder of Nova Holdings, LLC. Dominic zoomed in on the signature line, the black ink stark against the bright white screen. The entire ballroom erupted into loud, shocked gasps. My mother dropped her wineglass, the red liquid staining the white tablecloth like blood. Bradley stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing silently, as the oxygen left his lungs. The name on the screen, the absolute owner of the highly lucrative development Bradley was illegally trying to sell to the crowded room, was clearly and undeniably Olivia. I smiled. The ballroom erupted into pure, unadulterated chaos. My mother dropped her wineglass. It shattered on the floor, but the sound was completely swallowed by the overlapping shouts and furious murmurs of the wealthy guests who had just been aggressively pitched an investment by a man who owned absolutely nothing. Bradley stood paralyzed on the dance floor. His eyes darted desperately from the massive projection of my name to the faces of the investors he had just attempted to defraud. He looked like a man drowning in an ocean of his own lies. His charm evaporated, replaced by frantic panic. He locked eyes with me, his face contorted with a sudden violent rage. He stormed across the room, shoving past two bewildered waiters and my stunned father. Before Dominic could step in, Bradley grabbed my upper arm with a bruising grip and forcefully pulled me toward the heavy glass doors leading out to the venue terrace. I gave Dominic a sharp, subtle nod to stay put. I wanted to hear exactly what Bradley had to say. The cool ocean breeze hit my face the moment the doors clicked shut behind us, muting the loud uproar inside the grand ballroom completely. The terrace was entirely empty, lit only by a few flickering gas lanterns and the distant glow of the harbor. Bradley shoved me away, running a trembling hand through his perfectly styled hair. He paced the length of the wooden deck like a caged predator. His breathing was heavy and ragged. He stopped and turned to face me, his aristocratic mask stripped away entirely. There was no polished corporate developer left standing in front of me. There was only the bitter, desperate man I had married in my 20s. He pointed a shaking index finger directly at my calm face. He demanded to know how I had acquired the holding company. He accused me of hacking his private files, of staging an elaborate illegal corporate coup just to ruin his life. I simply straightened the sleeve of my charcoal slip dress. I calmly informed him that acquiring distressed debt was perfectly legal. I explained that when he defaulted on his initial mezzanine loans 3 months ago, my firm simply purchased the holding company for pennies on the dollar. He had literally signed away his ownership rights in the fine print of his own desperate refinancing contracts with his complete ignorance. Bradley widened his eyes with manic realization. He took a menacing step closer, invading my personal space, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me. He let out a dark, guttural laugh. He told me that I thought I was untouchable because I ran a highly successful public relations firm. He noted that my entire business model relied on fixing the reputations of wealthy clients, which meant my own reputation had to remain completely flawless. He reached deeply into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out his cell phone, tapping the cracked glass screen aggressively with his right thumb. He stated that if I did not immediately transfer the holding company back to his name, he would ruin me. He threatened to release my complete unredacted medical records from our marriage to the tabloids and every major industry blog. He stepped so close I could smell the stale scotch on his breath. He dropped his voice into a cruel and mocking sneer. He brought up the endless doctor appointments, the hormone injections, and the devastating silence of the fertility clinics. He looked me up and down with absolute disgust. He told me that he never loved me at all. He claimed he left me solely because I was fundamentally broken. He spat out the vicious words stating that a woman who could not even give him a biological child was completely useless to him. He threatened to aggressively spin a public narrative that the infertility treatments had made me mentally unstable, totally hysterical, and entirely unfit to manage high-stakes corporate crises for my wealthy clients. He promised to paint me as a bitter and unhinged ex-wife, obsessed with destroying him because I failed at my basic biological duties. He waited eagerly for my tears to fall down. He waited for my breath to hitch, for the old dark insecurities to rise to the surface and break my calm composure. 6 years ago, those awful words would have shattered me completely. I would have collapsed on the wooden deck begging him to stop hurting me. But standing there under the dim light of the gas lanterns, I felt absolutely nothing but a deep clinical pity for the pathetic man standing in front of me. I did not flinch once. I did not break our intense eye contact. I simply maintained a posture of perfect and relaxed quiet stillness. I let his cruel insults wash over me like water off a stone. I tilted my head, studying him as if he were a fascinating, slightly repulsive insect. The complete lack of emotional reaction unnerved him. His confident posture faltered. He opened his mouth to deliver another insult, but I held up a single finger, silencing him instantly. I casually retrieved my own smartphone from my silk clutch. I tapped the bright screen exactly once, bringing up a highly secure encrypted audio folder. I told Bradley that releasing stolen medical records was a severe federal crime with very harsh penalties. However, it was absolutely nothing compared to the digital footprint he carelessly left behind 6 years ago. I pressed play. The recorded audio was slightly grainy, but the arrogant voice was unmistakably Bradley's, slurring heavily from too many expensive bourbons. The recording echoed across the empty terrace. It was a drunken voicemail he left me, explicitly detailing how he siphoned $300,000 of seed capital into a private offshore account, hiding the theft under false vendor invoices. I stepped very close. "If you ever leak my medical history, this goes to the SEC in 5 seconds," I whispered. The heavy glass terrace doors crashed open, the metal hinges groaning against the sudden force. Patricia marched onto the wooden deck, the emerald fabric of her gown snapping around her ankles. Her eyes darted frantically between Bradley and me, but she immediately rushed to Bradley's side, placing a manicured hand protectively on his arm. She glared at me, her chest heaving with exertion and indignation. She did not ask if I was all right. She did not ask what Bradley had just been saying to me. She simply demanded that I stop this ridiculous stunt immediately. Patricia ordered me to march back into that ballroom, take the microphone, and announce that Nova Holdings was a joint venture. She demanded I sign the Apex Ridge land deed over to Bradley right now to keep the peace and save the family from public humiliation. I stared at my mother, the cool ocean breeze whipping a strand of hair across my face. I asked her why she was so desperate to protect a man who had publicly humiliated her own daughter 6 years ago. I asked her why Bradley's financial reputation mattered more to her than my dignity. Patricia let out a sharp, exasperated sigh, dropping her hand from Bradley's arm. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and absolute disdain. She stated that Bradley was a visionary, and that visionaries required a certain caliber of support. She crossed her arms, standing tall in her heels, and finally dropped the heavy facade she had carried for a decade. She told me to stop playing the wounded victim because she was the one who had invited Natalie to the lake house that weekend 6 years ago. The air on the terrace grew perfectly still. I asked her to clarify exactly what she meant. Patricia did not hesitate. She confessed that she had deliberately sent the housekeeping staff home early. She confessed that she had intentionally asked me to run a meaningless errand into town, specifically so Bradley and Natalie would be left alone in the house with a liquor cabinet. She looked me up and down, her lip curling in disgust. She stated that Bradley was destined for high society greatness, and he needed a wife who understood that world. He needed someone prettier, someone more compliant, someone who cared about hosting galas instead of obsessing over corporate crisis management accounts. She stated that Natalie fit the profile of a successful developer's wife, while I was just a plain, stubborn disappointment who refused to play the game. She had orchestrated the destruction of my marriage simply because I did not fit her vision of a perfect daughter. Bradley smirked, adjusting his cuffs, clearly emboldened by my mother's vicious confession. A profound, icy calm washed over my body. The last remaining fragile thread tethering me to the woman who gave birth to me dissolved. I did not feel the familiar, desperate childhood urge to earn her love. I did not feel the crushing weight of her rejection. I felt absolutely nothing for her. I looked at Patricia, stripping away any trace of daughterly deference. I told her in a voice that I would never sign the land over to Bradley. I stated that he was a fraud and I was going to let the federal auditors tear his fake empire to the ground. I told her that she had backed the wrong horse. Patricia's face flushed a deep crimson, her eyes widened in fury. She took a step toward me, raising her voice to a pitch. She declared that if I walked back into that ballroom and ruined Bradley, I would no longer be a member of the family. She threatened to call their estate attorney first thing Monday morning. She promised to rewrite the family trust and disinherit me. She swore I would not receive a cent of family wealth, no access to the trust funds, and no share of the ancestral home on Maple Drive. She commanded me to choose between a petty revenge stunt and my entire financial future. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match her screaming. I reached into my silk clutch for the second time that evening. I bypassed the smartphone and my credit cards. My fingers brushed against a thick piece of legal parchment. I pulled the document out and held it up in the dim light. I asked Patricia if she had ever wondered why my father Richard had stopped talking about his stock market investments over the past 3 years. I asked if she had noticed the sudden drop in their country club spending. Patricia frowned, her rant halting as confusion clouded her features. I unfolded the parchment and smoothed it out. I explained that my father did not lose that money in the stock market. He lost it placing bets through an underground sports gambling syndicate. I told her that Richard had accumulated over $2 million in debt. To keep the bookies from showing up at their front door and destroying their social standing, he had sought out a private wealth management firm to secure an emergency leverage loan. He needed capital fast, and he had no liquid assets left to his name. Patricia shook her head, taking a step backward. She stammered my father would never do something so reckless. She insisted the family home was fully paid off. I looked directly into my mother's eyes. I told her that Richard had used the only asset he had left. He had leveraged the deed to the Maple Drive estate as collateral for the loan. I stepped forward, holding the document out so she could clearly read the print at the top of the page. I informed her that the private wealth management firm that held the lien on her house was a subsidiary of my portfolio. I told Patricia she could not disinherit me from the family home because I already owned the roof over her head. Patricia stood frozen, staring at the property deed, her pristine reality shattering. The matriarch, who had just threatened to disinherit me, now realized she owned nothing. Before she could formulate a defense for my father's crippling gambling debt, the heavy terrace doors burst open. Kendrick stormed onto the deck. My brother-in-law looked completely unhinged. His silk tie was loose and heavy sweat stained his tailored shirt. His face was a panicked red and his chest heaved as he scanned the dim terrace. He completely ignored Patricia. Kendrick's wild eyes locked directly onto Bradley. He lunged forward, closing the distance in 3 massive strides. He grabbed Bradley by the lapels of his custom tuxedo, slamming him back against the brick wall. The dull thud echoed sharply in the night air. Bradley gasped, his hands flying up to break Kendrick's suffocating grip. But Kendrick held on with the desperate strength of a man staring over the edge of a cliff. Kendrick demanded to know where the money was. His voice was a guttural hiss, thick with sheer terror. He shook Bradley violently. Kendrick stated that he had just checked the encrypted digital wallets on his phone. He revealed that every single cent of the crypto funds he had funneled into Bradley's accounts had completely vanished. The digital transfer he initiated 48 hours ago The transfer that included my parents' entire life savings showed a zero balance. Bradley gagged, trying to loosen Kendrick's white-knuckled grip on his throat. He put his hands up in a defensive gesture, instinctively slipping back into his polished corporate persona despite being pinned against a brick wall. Bradley forced a strained, artificial chuckle. He told Kendrick to calm down and stop overreacting, claiming that this was simply a temporary market fluctuation. He insisted that the crypto market was highly volatile and that the blockchain ledgers were experiencing a momentary syncing delay across the international servers. He promised Kendrick that the funds would reappear in the digital wallets by Monday morning with a massive yield. Kendrick let out a raw, desperate scream of pure rage. He shoved Bradley harder against the brickwork, his voice breaking as he outlined the catastrophic reality of his situation. Kendrick confessed that he had not just invested his own capital. He admitted that he had illegally leveraged his own clients' portfolios to secure the funds for Bradley's real estate venture. He screamed that if that money did not reappear immediately, he was not just facing bankruptcy. He was facing federal prison for massive corporate embezzlement. Bradley finally lost his composure. The charismatic facade cracked, revealing the terrified, cornered coward underneath. He shoved back, driving his elbow hard into Kendrick's ribs. Kendrick grunted in pain, but the strike only fueled his absolute panic. He swung a heavy, uncoordinated fist, catching Bradley squarely on the jaw. Bradley stumbled sideways, blood instantly welling up along his lower lip. The violent momentum carried both men away from the brick wall and directly toward the heavy glass doors. Kendrick tackled Bradley, their combined weight sending the doors crashing open. The two men spilled violently from the quiet terrace directly onto the edge of the packed dance floor. The lively jazz music screeched to a chaotic halt. The upright bass player dropped his bow, the sharp, discordant note echoing through the grand ballroom. Over 200 wealthy guests gasped in collective horror, stepping back in a massive wave to form a wide circle around the two men brawling on the polished hardwood. Champagne glasses shattered as tables were bumped in the sudden panic. Kendrick pinned Bradley to the floor, gripping him by the throat and screaming for his money. Diana pushed her way to the front of the horrified crowd. She stood paralyzed, her hands clamped over her mouth as she watched her husband actively choking the man she thought was their financial savior. Natalie stood a few feet away, her face drained of all color, staring at the blood dripping from Bradley's mouth. Dominic and Leo remained perfectly still at the edge of the circle, watching the destruction unfold exactly as I had calculated. My mother stumbled into the ballroom behind me, clutching her chest, utterly broken by the revelations of her ruined house and family. She could not process the violence erupting in front of her. I smoothed the fabric of my slip dress and stepped calmly through the shattered glass doors. I walked into the center of the panicked crowd, the heels of my shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. The guests parted from me, sensing the absolute authority radiating from my posture. I did not raise my voice, nor did I show a single ounce of fear or distress. I stopped 1 foot away from where Kendrick was kneeling over Bradley's battered frame. I looked down at them with cold, clinical precision. I told Kendrick to let him go because Bradley could not return the crypto funds. Kendrick froze his chest, heaving, his desperate eyes snapping up to meet mine. He begged me to tell him where the money went, tears of terror tracking down his flushed cheeks. I opened my silk clutch one final time. I pulled out a neatly folded sheet of printed paper. I crouched gracefully, maintaining perfect balance in my heels, and held the document out to Kendrick. I told him that Bradley did not lose a single dime in a volatile market fluctuation. I explained that the printed bank ledger in my hand proved exactly where the missing capital had gone. I watched Kendrick snatch the paper, his eyes scanning the highlighted transaction lines with desperation. I leaned in close, ensuring Bradley could hear every single word. I stated that Bradley had legally transferred every cent of Kendrick's embezzled crypto funds directly into an untraceable offshore shell account located in the Cayman Islands. I pointed a steady finger at the terrified woman standing nearby. I announced the offshore account was registered exclusively under Natalie's name. Kendrick released his grip on Bradley's throat, his bloodshot eyes darting from the printed bank ledger in my hand to Natalie's pale, horrified face. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal short-circuited his rage for a fraction of a second. Natalie took a stumbling step backward, her beaded gown catching the harsh glare of the ballroom chandeliers. She violently shook her head, holding her hands up as if to physically ward off the truth. She stammered out a denial, claiming she had absolutely no idea what an offshore shell company was, and insisting that Bradley must have used her identity without her consent. Kendrick did not care about her excuses. He lunged away from Bradley and charged directly at Natalie, his heavy footsteps thudding against the polished dance floor. Two broad-shouldered groomsmen immediately stepped out from the paralyzed crowd, intercepting Kendrick and holding him back by his arms. Kendrick fought against their grip, screaming at Natalie that she had destroyed his entire life and demanding she return his stolen capital. The crowd of wedding guests erupted into a deafening chorus of outrage and disgust. The wealthy investors Bradley had tried to woo only minutes ago were now pulling out their cell phones, frantically calling their private wealth managers and personal attorneys to ensure their own portfolios were secure. The pristine country club elite were actively backing away from Bradley and Natalie, as if the couple carried a highly contagious disease. Natalie looked frantically around the grand ballroom, searching the faces of her so-called friends and allies for a single ounce of sympathy or protection. She found absolutely nothing but cold, judgmental glares and shaking heads. She was completely trapped, stripped of her fake wealth, and facing imminent criminal prosecution alongside her fraudulent husband. Panic completely overtook Natalie's features. Her chest heaved rapidly and her carefully styled hair clung to her sweating forehead. She needed an immediate shield, a trump card to halt the impending destruction. Natalie let out a piercing, hysterical scream that sliced right through the chaotic noise of the ballroom. She demanded that everyone shut their mouths and stop attacking her family. She clawed her way up the two wooden steps onto the main stage, positioning herself directly under the brightest spotlight. She grabbed the microphone stand, her knuckles turning bone white as she gripped the metal pole. She took a deep theatrical breath, forcing a steady stream of calculated tears to spill over her eyelashes and down her flushed cheeks. She placed a protective, trembling hand over her flat stomach and stared fiercely into the crowd. Natalie's voice echoed through the massive speakers, carrying a desperate manufactured vulnerability. She announced to the entire room that she was 3 months pregnant with Bradley's child. She declared that she was carrying the true heir to the family legacy, a precious, innocent life that needed absolute protection from this cruel witch hunt. She dramatically gestured toward me, accusing me of trying to stress a pregnant woman into a miscarriage purely out of bitter jealousy. She begged my parents and the remaining guests to look at the bigger picture, insisting that a new baby represented a fresh start and a beautiful future that outweighed any temporary financial misunderstandings. She claimed that Bradley was just an over-eager provider who made a few overly aggressive business maneuvers strictly to ensure his future son or daughter would never want for anything. She leaned heavily into the microphone, sobbing loudly, playing the ultimate role of the devoted, victimized mother-to-be who was just trying to keep her growing family intact. The ballroom fell into a stunned, uneasy silence. The sudden invocation of an unborn child acted like a bucket of ice water on the furious crowd. Kendrick stopped struggling against the groomsmen, his chest heaving as he stared at his pregnant sister-in-law in shock. My mother let out a soft, dramatic gasp, her hands flying to her mouth as her grandmotherly instincts violently clashed with the reality of Bradley's criminal actions. Natalie stood on the stage, weeping softly into her hands, secretly peeking through her fingers to gauge the success of her ultimate emotional manipulation. She truly believed she had just played the perfect, unbeatable card. I stood in the center of the dance floor, my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting comfortably at my sides. I did not feel a single twinge of surprise, jealousy, or anger. I looked up at the stage and felt a deep, overwhelming wave of profound pity for the woman clutching the microphone stand. I slowly turned my gaze away from Natalie's theatrical performance and locked eyes with Bradley. He was still kneeling on the hardwood floor where Kendrick had dropped him, wiping a smear of blood from his split lip with the back of his trembling hand. He was staring at Natalie with a look of absolute, unadulterated horror. He was not looking at her with the pride or protective instinct of an expectant father. He was looking at her as if she had just grown a second head. I took 2 slow, deliberate steps toward him, the sharp clicking of my heels cutting through the dead quiet of the room. I tilted my head, studying his pale, sweating face with cold amusement. I asked Bradley if he was going to tell her or if I should. Bradley swallowed hard, the muscles in his throat bobbing erratically. He squeezed his eyes shut and violently shook his head, completely unable to form a single coherent word. I turned to the stage, raising my voice so it carried to every corner of the room. I announced that 5 years ago, Bradley visited a discreet private clinic. He paid $10,000 in cash for a permanent vasectomy to avoid paying child support. I stated he proudly bragged about it to my firm, giving us his certification. I told Natalie it was biologically impossible for Bradley to father a child. "So, Natalie, whose baby is it?" The silence following my question was absolute. It hung over the ballroom like a guillotine waiting to drop. Natalie's manufactured tears vanished instantly, leaving her face a mask of chalky terror. She dropped the microphone. It hit the wooden stage with a sharp electronic squeal that made the closest guests flinch. She looked down at Kendrick, who was still kneeling on the floor, panting heavily. Kendrick stared back at her, his eyes wide with a horrifying realization. A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of wealthy guests. Diana stood at the very edge of the clearing, her hands slowly lowering from her mouth. Her eyes darted between her sweating husband on the floor and the pale, trembling woman frozen on the stage. The gears in her analytical mind turned with terrifying speed. She marched forward, pushing past a stunned groomsman. Her heels struck the polished floor like a metronome, counting down to an execution. She stopped directly in front of Kendrick. She did not scream or cry. She spoke with a lethal, icy clarity that carried to every single person in the quiet room. Diana stated that the pieces finally fit together perfectly. She reminded Kendrick of his sudden, unexplained need to take extensive business trips over the past 4 months. She listed the locations aloud, marking them off on her manicured fingers. Aspen in February, the Cayman Islands in March, St. Bart's just 3 weeks ago. She pivoted sharply, her blistering gaze locking onto Natalie. Diana pointed out that Natalie had coincidentally missed several mandatory family gatherings during those exact same weekends, claiming she was attending exclusive off-the-grid wellness retreats to manage her stress. Diana's voice rose, vibrating with pure, unadulterated fury. She announced to the horrified crowd that her husband had not just committed massive corporate fraud. He had deliberately embezzled millions of dollars from his trusting clients and funneled that stolen wealth directly into an offshore account to fund a secret, luxurious double life with his brother-in-law's wife. She looked up at Natalie's stomach, her expression twisting into a mask of utter revulsion. She stated that Kendrick was the only man in the room who could possibly be the father of that child. Natalie scrambled down the wooden steps of the stage, her hands outstretched in a desperate, pathetic gesture of supplication. She shook her head wildly, dark mascara smearing her cheeks. She cried out Diana's name, begging her to listen, claiming it was a terrible mistake and that Kendrick had manipulated her into the arrangement. She tried to reach out and grab Diana's hands, attempting to play the role of the helpless victim one last time. Diana did not yield a single inch. She planted her feet firmly, pulled her right arm back, and delivered a devastating, open-handed slap squarely across Natalie's cheek. The sharp, violent crack of the impact echoed off the vaulted ceiling, entirely drowning out the shocked murmurs of the crowd. Natalie shrieked, stumbling backward and collapsing in a heap onto the hardwood floor. She clutched her stinging face, staring up at Diana in absolute shock. A bright, angry red handprint rapidly bloomed across her pale skin. Diana stared down at the ruined woman, her chest heaving with adrenaline. She commanded Natalie to keep her filthy hands away from her. She then turned her blistering wrath back to Kendrick. He was still on his knees, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. He reached forward and grabbed the hem of his wife's silk dress, stammering out a chaotic string of apologies. He promised he could fix everything if she just gave him a chance to access the offshore accounts and transfer the money back. Diana violently stepped back, kicking her husband's hands away with the pointed toe of her stiletto. She declared that she was entirely done with him. She reached for her left hand and violently twisted her massive diamond engagement ring off her finger. She threw the heavy ring directly at Kendrick's chest. It hit him with a dull thud and bounced away, rolling uselessly across the dance floor. Diana promised him that she would be calling her divorce attorney first thing in the morning. She added that she would personally hand over every single piece of financial documentation in his home office to the federal authorities. She swore she would watch his entire life burn to ash. Kendrick looked around the grand ballroom, the reality of his total destruction finally settling over his panicked brain. He saw Bradley bleeding and bruised, glaring at him with a murderous, unhinged rage. He saw the wealthy country club investors actively dialing their phones, reporting the massive embezzlement to the police. He saw his wife walking away from him forever. He was facing immediate bankruptcy, a vicious divorce, and decades in a federal penitentiary. Complete animalistic panic hijacked his mind. Kendrick scrambled to his feet, slipping frantically on the slick floor. He shoved blindly through the tight circle of horrified wedding guests, knocking a heavy silver tray of champagne flutes from a waiter's hands. The glass shattered everywhere, but Kendrick did not stop. He sprinted toward the grand mahogany doors leading to the main foyer, desperate to escape the suffocating walls of his own making. I smoothed the skirt of my slip dress and walked calmly after him, matching my pace with Dominic and Leo, who fell into step silently beside me. We glided through the shattered remnants of the reception, stepping out the front doors, into the humid night air, just as Kendrick reached the illuminated valet stand under the main portico. Kendrick was a complete mess. His tuxedo jacket was torn, his custom shirt was soaked in sweat, and his breathing was ragged and shallow. He slammed his crumpled valet ticket down onto the wooden podium, screaming at the young, terrified attendant to bring his black Porsche immediately. He slammed his fist against the podium, demanding the keys, looking frantically over his shoulder toward the country club doors for any sign of pursuing police sirens. The young attendant jumped, clutching the ticket with shaking hands. He awkwardly cleared his throat, stepping back from Kendrick's wild, unpredictable energy. He stammered softly, informing Kendrick that he could not retrieve the vehicle. Kendrick grabbed the attendant by the collar of his uniform, spittle flying from his lips as he demanded to know exactly where his car was. The attendant pointed a trembling finger toward the empty VIP parking space at the far edge of the circular drive. He explained that a heavy-duty tow truck had arrived exactly 10 minutes ago. He stated that the Porsche had just been repossessed. Kendrick froze, releasing the attendant's collar. He turned around, his wild eyes scanning the empty pavement. He screamed into the night, demanding to know who authorized the seizure of his property. Dominic stepped smoothly out of the dark shadows of the portico, casually adjusting his platinum cufflinks. He looked at Kendrick with a cold, predatory smile. Dominic stated that the car was repossessed under direct orders from the primary lien holder. He explained that his firm had quietly purchased the debt on all of Kendrick's luxury assets 3 weeks ago. He looked Kendrick up and down, taking in his ruined, sweating state. Dominic informed him that since Kendrick had missed his last 2 payments, the Porsche, the yacht, and the downtown penthouse now legally belonged to his portfolio. Kendrick stared at Dominic, his mouth opening and closing as the catastrophic reality crushed the last ounce of breath from his lungs. The Porsche, the yacht, the penthouse, all stripped away in the blink of an eye. Dominic adjusted his platinum cufflinks with deliberate slowness, offering Kendrick a patronizing smile. He advised Kendrick to call a cab before his credit cards were frozen as well. Kendrick dropped to his knees on the cobblestone driveway, clutching his ruined hair in his hands. Before he could utter a single pathetic plea, a high and piercing sound sliced through the heavy, humid night air. The distant, unmistakable wail of police sirens drifted over the rolling hills of the golf course. The shrill noise grew louder by the second, multiplying in volume and intensity. It was not just one patrol car, it was an entire fleet tearing down the winding access road toward the country club. I turned my back on the pathetic scene at the valet stand and walked smoothly back through the shattered glass doors into the grand ballroom. Panic had fully seized the remaining wedding guests. The approaching sirens signaled the absolute end of the masquerade, and the wealthy elite were practically trampling each other to reach the coat check. Patricia stood frozen in the center of the chaos, her emerald gown trembling as she hyperventilated. Her chest heaved erratically, and her perfectly styled hair was a frayed, tangled mess. When her frantic eyes locked onto me, her panic morphed into venomous hatred. She lunged forward, grabbing my forearm with clawed fingers. She screamed over the rising noise, blaming me for orchestrating this entire nightmare. She shrieked that I had destroyed my own sister, ruined the legacy of our father, and shattered the family beyond repair, out of sheer petty spite. I looked straight down at her shaking hand, then back up to her tear-streaked face. I gently peeled her fingers off my skin. I told my mother that I did not destroy this family. I simply turned on the lights and let everyone see the rot that she had spent the last decade fiercely protecting. The wailing sirens finally reached a deafening crescendo, immediately followed by the aggressive, high-pitched screech of heavy tires locking up on the cobblestone driveway just outside the main portico. Bright red and blue emergency lights violently bathed the ballroom windows in a frantic, strobing glow. Bradley scrambled up from the hardwood floor, his eyes wide, wild, and completely devoid of basic human reason. He looked at Natalie, who was still weeping loudly in a crumpled heap, and he stepped right over her legs. He did not offer his pregnant, battered wife a single sympathetic glance. Pure self-preservation entirely hijacked his nervous system. He spun around quickly, frantically searching for a blind spot in the panicked, surging crowd. Spotting the side exit leading directly toward the kitchen corridors, Bradley instantly bolted. He sprinted recklessly across the polished dance floor, violently shoving a terrified bridesmaid completely out of his path, desperately lunging for the swinging wooden doors that offered a dark hidden path out into the back service alleys. He never made it. Dominic stepped up closely beside me and lazily snapped his fingers in the air. In perfect practice synchronization, 4 massive men wearing impeccably tailored tuxedos detached themselves from the scattering crowd. They had spent the entire evening quietly sipping sparkling water and blending in seamlessly as regular invited wedding guests. Now the private security detail of Dominic moved with terrifying lethal precision. They stepped smoothly in front of the kitchen doors, tightly crossing their thick arms to form an impenetrable wall of solid, unyielding muscle. Bradley could not stop his desperate momentum. He crashed headfirst into the broad chest of the largest guard, violently bouncing off the man like a broken toy and tumbling backward onto the hard floor. The formidable guards did not even flinch. They simply stared down at his pathetic frame with cold, professional indifference. There was absolutely no way out. The massive grand double doors of the ballroom suddenly burst wide open. A dozen heavily armed, uniformed local police officers rapidly swarmed into the room, immediately securing the entire perimeter. Right behind them, confidently marched 4 federal agents in dark, severe suits, their silver badges gleaming sharply against the flashing emergency lights outside. The towering lead agent, an incredibly tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern, weathered face, quickly scanned the chaotic room before locking his sights directly onto Bradley. The stern agent pulled a thick stack of printed warrants from his inner jacket pocket and marched purposefully across the dance floor. Bradley frantically scrambled backward on his hands and knees, desperately scrambling away from the encroaching officers like a trapped, cornered animal. He pointed a violently shaking, blood-stained finger directly at my face. Bradley screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated desperation. He loudly swore to the federal agents that I had illegally planted the offshore accounts. He shrieked that I had completely fabricated the digital ledgers to frame him for corporate embezzlement simply because I was a bitter, jealous ex-wife trying to ruin his perfect life. The lead federal agent stopped just a few feet away, looking down at Bradley with an expression of absolute profound disgust. He slowly shook his head, completely unmoved by the frantic, pathetic display. The stern, unyielding agent flatly stated that I had absolutely nothing to do with their sudden arrival. He looked Bradley dead in the eye and delivered the final crushing blow. He loudly and clearly informed Bradley that his own trusted business partner had completely flipped. The lead federal agent stated that his terrified business partner had walked straight into the Federal Bureau at exactly 6 this morning and eagerly handed over every single set of his meticulously cooked corporate financial books, encrypted hard drives, and illegal wire transfer logs to completely avoid serving any lengthy federal jail time. The harsh metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around Bradley's wrists cut sharply through the oppressive silence of the grand ballroom. The lead federal agent, a towering man with a face carved from granite, forcefully spun the ruined groom around, pressing his chest flat against the polished mahogany surface of a nearby dining table. The agent recited the Miranda rights with a bored, practiced monotony, each steady word driving another solid nail into the coffin of Bradley's magnificent fake empire. Bradley did not even attempt to fight back. He slumped forward heavily against the expensive wood, his previously immaculate custom tuxedo now transformed into a wrinkled, damp-stained rag. His handsome face was completely drained of all that arrogant, untouchable charm that had fooled my family for years. Natalie remained crumpled in a pathetic, glittering heap on the polished hardwood dance floor. She was weeping hysterically, clutching her stomach, entirely ignored by the cornered husband who had just tried to use her fake pregnancy as a cowardly human shield against federal prosecution. The remaining country club elites who had spent the entire evening sipping vintage champagne and celebrating this fraudulent union now muttered in hushed, scandalized tones. Their terrified eyes darted nervously toward the exit doors, desperate to distance themselves from the catastrophic scene unfolding before them. The lavish wedding reception had fully transitioned into an active federal crime scene. Dominic and Leo stood quietly near the velvet-covered walls, watching the absolute destruction of their enemies with cold, calculated satisfaction. The wailing police sirens outside slowly died down, replaced by the chaotic crackle of police radios echoing through the main foyer. The sheer magnitude of the public humiliation was suffocating. Every single guest in attendance was witnessing the complete annihilation of the family's carefully manufactured social standing. The glittering chandeliers above cast a harsh, unforgiving light on the absolute wreckage of my mother's lifelong ambition. Suddenly, my father violently pushed his way through the murmuring crowd. His face was flushed a dangerous mottled purple, and thick veins bulged visibly along his neck. Richard had spent his entire adult life meticulously cultivating his pristine reputation among the wealthy Boston elite. He had sacrificed absolutely everything, including his relationship with his own daughter, to ensure he was perceived as a titan of industry and an untouchable pillar of high society. Now watching his chosen golden son-in-law being hauled away in handcuffs like a common street thief, Richard was actively drowning in the sheer, unadulterated terror of permanent social annihilation. He saw the deeply judgmental glares of his wealthy peers. He heard the venomous whispered gossip that would inevitably dominate the country club dining rooms tomorrow morning. His legacy was actively turning to ash right in front of his eyes. He desperately needed a convenient scapegoat. He needed a target. Richard marched directly toward me, his chest puffed out in a desperate, pathetic display of manufactured authority. He stopped mere inches from my face, completely ignoring the federal agents hauling Bradley toward the exit. He pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my chest. His voice boomed aggressively across the ruined ballroom, demanding that everyone look at the terrible destruction I had selfishly caused. He loudly declared that I was a toxic, vindictive liar who had meticulously orchestrated this entire criminal spectacle purely out of bitter, petty jealousy. He wildly claimed that I was a deeply unstable, unhappy woman who simply could not stand to see her younger sister achieve the fabulous wealth and romantic happiness that I so desperately lacked. He shouted that I had deliberately framed a brilliant, innocent businessman just to satisfy my own twisted vendetta against a family that had done nothing but try to love and support me. Richard then puffed himself up even larger, dramatically turning his back to me so he could directly address the whispering, horrified crowd. He loudly proclaimed to his wealthy peers that my malicious actions tonight were a permanent, unforgivable stain on the prestigious family name. He announced utilizing sweeping theatrical gestures that as of this exact second, I was completely and permanently disowned from his household. He swore loudly that I would be legally excised from the family trust fund tomorrow morning. He promised that I would be totally erased from the ancestral lineage and permanently barred from ever stepping foot inside the Maple Drive estate again. He begged the gathered investors to completely disregard my existence, desperately insisting that my criminal behavior did not reflect his values. I did not shed a single tear. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not break my steady gaze. I felt a profound, liberating emptiness, where my desperate childhood desire for his fatherly approval used to reside. The heavy, suffocating fear of his bitter disappointment had completely vanished from my soul, permanently replaced by an unbreakable, icy resolve. I simply walked right past him. I completely ignored his sputtering, angry facial outrage as I stepped up onto the low wooden stage. The heavy microphone Natalie had dropped earlier still lay abandoned on the polished floorboards, emitting a faint rhythmic hum. I bent down gracefully, picked up the cool metal cylinder, and tapped it twice with my index finger. The sharp, amplified thuds instantly silenced the last remaining murmurs in the sprawling ballroom. Every single eye in the room locked directly onto me. I stared down at the man who spent 3 decades making me feel incredibly small. I spoke into the microphone, my voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings with crystal-clear authority. I informed Richard he could not disinherit me from the family trust because there was absolutely no money left inside it. I reminded him of the $2 million he secretly lost to an underground sports gambling syndicate. I stated that his massive private wealth management loan was legally held by my portfolio. I officially executed the foreclosure clause. You have exactly 30 days to vacate my property. Consider yourselves legally and financially disowned. Richard collapsed backward into a gilded banquet chair, his mouth hanging open in a silent, suffocating gasp. The immense gravity of his absolute ruin finally crushed the remaining breath from his lungs. He was no longer the untouchable titan of Boston high society. He was just an evicted, bankrupt old man sitting in a rented tuxedo. The crowd of elite investors surrounding him did not offer a single word of comfort. They actively backed away from him, treating my father like a contagious disease. I dropped the microphone onto the floor. It hit the wood with a final heavy thud that signaled the absolute end of his tyrannical reign over my life. I turned my back on my family without a second glance. I had far more pressing matters to attend to on the other side of the grand ballroom. The 2 towering federal agents were currently hauling Bradley up from the polished hardwood floor. The heavy steel handcuffs binding his wrists clinked sharply against his expensive watch. His custom-tailored suit jacket hung off his shoulders in wrinkled, pathetic folds. The arrogant, untouchable aura he had worn like a shield for the entirety of our marriage had completely evaporated. He was sweating profusely, his chest heaving as he frantically looked around the room for any possible avenue of escape. He found absolutely nothing. Every single exit was securely blocked by Dominic's formidable security team or uniformed police officers. When Bradley's wild, panicked eyes finally locked onto mine, something entirely shattered inside his mind. The terrifying reality of decades in a federal penitentiary broke his spirit into a million jagged pieces. He began to thrash wildly against the iron grip of the federal agents. He dug his expensive leather shoes into the polished dance floor, violently throwing his body weight forward to stop them from dragging him toward the grand double doors. Bradley screamed my name. His voice was completely unrecognizable. It was a high, desperate shriek that echoed off the crystal chandeliers above. He violently ripped his shoulder out of the lead agent's grasp and deliberately threw himself onto his knees directly in front of me. The heavy impact of his kneecaps striking the hardwood floor echoed through the silent ballroom. He looked up at me, tears and sweat freely streaming down his pale, blotchy face. He was hyperventilating, completely unable to construct a coherent sentence. He begged me to help him. He begged me to call my public relations firm immediately. He desperately pleaded with me to use my extensive media contacts to spin the story, to draft a crisis management press release, to somehow paint him as the innocent victim of a corporate misunderstanding. He loudly sobbed that I was the only person who could possibly save his public image. He frantically confessed to the entire room that he was nothing without my strategic guidance. He wept openly, admitting that my brilliant mind was the sole reason his firm had ever achieved any level of legitimate financial success. He sobbed that he needed my intellect to save his life. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the pathetic, weeping man kneeling at my feet. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or residual affection. I felt absolute refreshing indifference. I took a slow, deliberate breath, savoring the cool, conditioned air of the ballroom. I reached down and casually adjusted the smooth silk fabric of my elegant dress, smoothing out an invisible wrinkle near my hip. I tilted my head, studying his tear-soaked face, as if examining a deeply flawed, uninteresting painting. I let the agonizing silence stretch out, forcing him to suffer in the quiet anticipation of my response. When I finally spoke, my voice was smooth, cold, and razor-sharp. I looked directly into his red, bloodshot eyes and told him that my public relations firm was currently fully booked. I smiled coldly and stated that I only save clients with actual value. I told him he was nothing more than a depreciating liability. Bradley let out a guttural, wounded sob, dropping his head toward the floor as the absolute finality of my words struck him. Before he could utter another pathetic plea for mercy, Dominic stepped smoothly out of the shadows. He moved with a lethal, predatory grace, coming to a halt directly beside my right shoulder. He was holding a crisp, thick manila folder in his left hand. Dominic looked down at Bradley with an expression of pure, unadulterated corporate shark satisfaction. He slowly opened the folder and pulled out a stack of legal documents printed on heavy watermarked paper. Dominic casually tossed the documents onto the hardwood floor, right in front of Bradley's kneeling form. The papers scattered slightly, revealing bold, undeniable legal letterheads and federal corporate seals. Dominic adjusted his platinum cufflinks and cleared his throat. His voice projected easily across the quiet, captivated room. He informed Bradley that those documents were the formal, finalized notices of a hostile corporate takeover. Dominic explained that while Bradley was desperately trying to play the role of the wealthy groom tonight, his massive fraudulent investment firm was bleeding out on the operating table. Dominic stated that the moment Bradley's terrified business partner flipped and handed the financial ledgers over to the federal authorities this morning, the company's stock completely tanked. Dominic smiled a sharp, dangerous expression that promised absolute destruction. He announced that his own venture capital conglomerate had swooped in just 3 hours ago. He loudly declared that he had just legally absorbed the remaining shattered scraps of Bradley's entire corporate empire for pennies on the exact dollar. The monumental, unprecedented financial coup was absolutely staggering. Bradley stared down at the scattered papers, his breath shuddering violently in his throat. He realized he possessed absolutely nothing. Dominic leaned down slightly, bringing his face closer to Bradley's sweating, horrified expression. He lowered his voice to a dark, menacing whisper that carried perfectly through the dead silence of the room. Happy wedding day. The heavy, suffocating silence that followed Dominic's dark whisper was broken by the slow creak of the grand mahogany doors. The remaining guests turned their heads in absolute unison, their collective gaze shifting away from Bradley's total destruction on the dance floor. Kendrick stumbled back into the ballroom from the outdoor portico. He looked like a man who had just witnessed his own execution. His previously immaculate tuxedo jacket was hanging off one shoulder, the expensive fabric torn from his brief scuffle with the valet. His face was entirely drained of blood, presenting a sickly, translucent shade of gray under the harsh glare of the crystal chandeliers. He had just realized that the luxurious safety net he had spent years meticulously weaving from stolen funds had been completely incinerated. There was no getaway car. There was no hidden yacht. There was no offshore sanctuary. Dominic's hostile takeover had stripped him down to the bone, leaving him with absolutely nothing but the impending reality of a federal prison cell. Natalie, still crumpled in a pathetic, glittering heap on the polished hardwood, slowly lifted her head. Her dark mascara was smeared across her cheeks like war paint, and her carefully pinned hair hung in ragged, sweat-soaked clumps around her neck. She watched the federal agents roughly hauling Bradley up from the floor, his wrists securely bound in heavy steel handcuffs. She instantly calculated the brutal mathematics of her survival. Bradley was entirely useless to her now. He was a ruined, penniless convict who could offer her absolutely no protection from the impending legal fallout. Pure animalistic desperation flooded her wide, panic-stricken eyes. She needed a new lifeboat, and she needed it immediately. Natalie scrambled up from the floor, her high heels slipping wildly against the slick wood. She ignored the shocked gasps of the surrounding high society guests. She ignored the flashing red and blue emergency lights spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She locked her sights exclusively on Kendrick. Natalie launched herself across the ballroom, her beaded gown tearing as she desperately closed the distance between them. She crashed heavily into Kendrick's chest, her manicured hands clawing frantically at the lapels of his ruined tuxedo. She clutched her flat stomach with one hand, violently reviving the theatrical performance of the victimized, expectant mother. She sobbed hysterically, her voice echoing with a shrill, piercing desperation that made the closest guests physically recoil. She begged Kendrick to take her away. She pleaded with him to fulfill the lavish promises he had whispered to her in those secret stolen weekends in Aspen and St. Bart's. She frantically swore that they could start over, that they could use whatever hidden cash reserves he had left to escape this vicious witch hunt. She clung to him like a parasite, desperately refusing to let go of its dying host, loudly demanding that he step up and act like the powerful, wealthy provider he claimed to be. Kendrick stared down at the weeping, hysterical woman clawing at his chest. The arrogant, untouchable facade he had maintained for a decade, completely shattered, revealing the pathetic, cowardly core of his true nature. The sheer, suffocating pressure of losing his entire financial empire, his pristine social standing, and his freedom finally caused his mind to snap. Kendrick violently ripped Natalie's hands off his lapels. He shoved her backward with a brutal, explosive force. Natalie shrieked in shock, her arms flailing wildly as she lost her balance. She crashed hard onto the polished dance floor, sliding several feet before coming to a complete halt near the edge of the crowd. Kendrick did not offer her a single ounce of sympathy. He stood over her, his chest heaving, his face contorted with a vicious, unhinged rage. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing violently through the room. He blamed Natalie for absolutely everything. He shrieked that her insatiable, reckless greed and her sloppy, careless demands for luxury had directly exposed his embezzlement. He loudly declared that she had ruined his entire life, completely destroyed his pristine finances, and single-handedly orchestrated his catastrophic downfall. Diana stood perfectly still at the edge of the clearing, watching the ugly, pathetic spectacle unfold. For her entire life, her parents had meticulously brainwashed her into prioritizing absolute social perfection over genuine human decency. They had conditioned her to blindly support powerful, wealthy men, teaching her that maintaining the flawless illusion of a successful marriage was far more important than actual loyalty or respect. She slowly turned her head, looking at her father Richard, who was currently cowering near the coat check, frantically attempting to distance himself from the scandal. She looked at her mother Patricia, who was hyperventilating into a silk handkerchief, mourning the permanent loss of her country club status rather than the destruction of her family. In that precise, illuminating moment, the heavy, invisible chains of her toxic upbringing completely shattered. Diana looked back at Kendrick, the man she had sworn to love and honor. She did not see a powerful executive or a respectable husband. She saw a weak, sniveling, treacherous coward who would instantly throw his pregnant mistress to the wolves just to save his own skin. Diana did not shed a single solitary tear. Her posture straightened, projecting a terrifying authority that commanded the absolute silence of the room. She walked with deliberate precision toward a nearby table where Kendrick had abandoned his champagne flute. She reached right down and slid her plain gold wedding band off her finger. She held the ring suspended over the glass for a fraction of a second before letting it drop. The heavy ring hit the bottom of the flute with a sharp clink that severed her marriage forever. She calmly announced that she had already legally frozen his remaining clean assets. Diana slowly walked across the floor and stopped directly in front of me, Olivia. For the very first time ever, she looked at me with genuine respect. Diana walked away, leaving the wreckage of her marriage behind, without a single backward glance. I watched her go, acknowledging the profound shift in power. The grand ballroom was a sprawling, chaotic disaster zone. Federal agents secured the perimeter, while their radios crackled over the stunned whispers of remaining guests. In the center of this destruction stood my mother, Patricia. She trembled visibly, desperately searching for any possible way to salvage her pulverized social standing. She spotted my cousin, the beautiful bride whose lavish reception had just been violently transformed into a federal crime scene. My cousin stood near the shattered remnants of an ice sculpture, her white silk gown contrasting sharply with the dark suits of the police officers. Patricia took a deep breath, smoothed down her dress, and rushed toward her niece. I stepped forward, staying just close enough to hear every single word. Patricia threw herself at the bride, her hands fluttering in frantic gestures. She loudly begged her niece for forgiveness, theatrically dabbing at dry eyes with a handkerchief. Patricia wailed she was mortified by my actions, insisting I was a toxic individual who intentionally set out to ruin the bride's life. She grabbed her niece's hands, squeezing them very tightly. Patricia babbled on, promising Richard had already disowned me, and our family would personally compensate her for the ruined reception. She frantically assured the bride my vicious lies would be dealt with swiftly, trying to paint me as a lone malicious actor in an otherwise flawless family tree. Patricia begged the bride not to let my selfish behavior sever the ties between their respectable families. She was willing to crucify me in front of everyone just to preserve her country club invitations. The bride did not shed a tear over her ruined reception. She did not offer Patricia a sympathetic smile and certainly did not return the frantic squeeze of her hands. Instead, my cousin calmly pulled her hands away from my mother's desperate grip. She stared down at Patricia with an expression of pure disgust. The absolute silence from the bride caused Patricia's frantic babbling to falter. My mother stood there confused by the total lack of emotional reciprocation. The bride took a deliberate step forward, her white gown rustling against the debris-covered floor. She did not raise her voice, but her words sliced through the air with lethal precision. She commanded Patricia to stop talking immediately. She stated that watching my mother attempt to salvage her fake reputation was the most nauseating thing she had witnessed all evening. Patricia gasped loudly in genuine shock, unable to comprehend the sudden hostility. She stammered out a deeply confused question, asking why the bride was attacking her when I was the one who had destroyed the wedding. My cousin let out a sharp, bitter laugh that lacked any warmth. She looked my mother dead in the eye and delivered a revelation that made the blood drain entirely from Patricia's face. The bride stated that I did not ruin anything today. She announced with chilling clarity that she had personally orchestrated this entire explosive scenario. She revealed she deliberately arranged the seating chart to place me at the very back of the room, forcing me into the shadows, where I could quietly observe the toxic dynamics. She confessed she intentionally pushed Bradley and Kendrick together, knowing exactly how volatile their secret alliance truly was. She stated she deliberately invited the key investors who would inevitably crack under the immense pressure. Patricia stumbled backward, her eyes wide with uncomprehending horror. The bride stepped closer, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. She told my mother she had spent her entire life watching Richard and Patricia systematically abuse, isolate, and belittle me. She stated she despised how the family treated me like a disposable scapegoat, while blindly worshipping men who were glorified criminals. The bride declared she decided months ago her wedding would not be a celebration of this rotted family. Instead, she meticulously designed this reception to be the perfect public stage for their downfall. She wanted Richard and Patricia to lose absolutely everything in front of the exact high society audience they valued more than their own daughter's life. Patricia let out a strangled sob, destroyed by the realization that her own niece willingly sacrificed her wedding day to orchestrate her total social annihilation. My mother covered her face with her hands, turning away in suffocating shame. She could not bear to look at the bride, and she certainly could not bear to look at me. The bride dismissed my weeping mother with a contemptuous wave of her hand. She turned her attention entirely to me. The coldness vanished from my cousin's eyes, replaced by a look of profound solidarity. She closed the distance between us, standing tall amidst the absolute wreckage of our family's empire. We stood facing each other for a long moment, sharing a deep, silent understanding. She reached down into the hidden pocket of her beaded bridal clutch and pulled out a small, sleek silver object. It was an encrypted USB drive. She held it out to me, the polished metal catching the harsh glare of the police lights strobing outside the windows. I looked down at the drive, then back up to her face. My cousin pressed the cool metal firmly into the center of my palm and curled my fingers tightly around it. She leaned in close, her voice dropping to a fierce conspiratorial whisper that carried the weight of absolute vengeance. She explained that her father had never trusted Richard's sudden explosive financial success. She revealed that her dad had spent the last decade keeping meticulous, undeniable digital records of every single time Uncle Richard had illegally siphoned money straight out of the restricted family trust fund. She stated that this drive contained the exact paper trail needed to completely dismantle the remaining fragments of his life. She stepped back, giving me a sharp, determined nod. Finish them. I closed my fingers tightly around the cool metal of the flash drive, feeling its sharp edges press against my skin. It was the ultimate weapon, the final nail in the coffin of Richard's fraudulent empire. My cousin gave me one last resolute nod before turning gracefully and walking away, leaving Patricia sobbing into her hands amid the shattered ice sculpture. The sprawling grand ballroom was trapped in a suffocating, bewildered silence. The remaining country club elites stood frozen in a state of absolute shock, processing the sheer magnitude of the destruction they had just witnessed. Bradley was being hauled out the double doors in handcuffs. Kendrick was hyperventilating in a corner, and the pristine illusion of our family was nothing but ash. The police officers stood by the exits, their radios occasionally breaking the heavy quiet. Nobody knew what to do, what to say, or even how to breathe. Then the rhythmic sound of confident footsteps echoed across the hardwood floor. Dominic walked calmly past the murmuring federal agents and stepped onto the low wooden stage. He bent down and retrieved the microphone I had dropped earlier. He tapped it once, ensuring it was still active, and looked out over the sea of horrified, glittering guests. Dominic did not puff out his chest. He did not boast about the hostile takeover he had just executed, nor did he gloat about the pennies he had spent to absorb Bradley's ruined company. His commanding presence alone was enough to instantly restore order to the chaotic room. Every terrified eye shifted toward him, desperate for leadership. Dominic ignored the ruined men and the weeping women. His intense dark eyes locked entirely onto me. He raised the microphone and began to speak, his deep voice wrapping around the room with a warm, steady authority. He told the gathered elites that tonight was supposed to be a celebration of a fraudulent union built on lies, stolen money, and unadulterated greed. He stated that instead, they were going to celebrate the only person in this room who actually possessed a shred of genuine integrity. He pointed a steady finger directly at me, demanding that every single person look at the woman they had spent years dismissing, underestimating, and actively trying to destroy. He declared that I was the true titan of industry, the brilliant architect of my own salvation, and the only reason any of them were standing there tonight. Dominic painted a vivid, unapologetic picture of my brutal journey. He told them exactly what happened when Bradley first betrayed me 5 years ago. He described how my arrogant former husband had meticulously drained our joint accounts legally, outmaneuvered me, and left me standing on the street with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back. He did not hold back a single detail. He told the horrified audience how I had been forced to rent a tiny, drafty studio apartment in the worst part of the city. He described the endless, grueling months I spent eating cheap ramen noodles for dinner because I could not afford groceries. He reminded them that while they were sipping vintage champagne and attending lavish charity galas, I was working 20-hour days, sleeping on a mattress on the floor, and slowly building my public relations and consulting firm from the absolute ground up. He stated that I had clawed my way back from total financial ruin through sheer, uncompromising grit and brilliant strategy. I did not ask for handouts. I did not crawl back to a family that despised me. I built an empire with my own two bare hands. The wealthy guests shifted uncomfortably in their expensive formal wear, their faces flushed with deep, undeniable shame. Dominic's words were a mirror reflecting their own shallow, parasitic behavior. He reminded them of the times they had snickered at my modest business attire, the moments they had excluded me from their elite networking events, and the vicious gossip they had eagerly consumed regarding my failed marriage. He praised my unyielding resilience, noting that I had absorbed every single insult and used it as fuel to propel my business forward. He spoke of the countless women who face the exact same suffocating, terrifying reality every single day. Women who are financially held hostage by arrogant, manipulative men who use money as a weapon of ultimate control. He stated that the legal system is often a labyrinth designed to protect the wealthy abuser, leaving the victim trapped voiceless and utterly defenseless. Dominic looked around the room, his jaw set with fierce determination, and announced that my personal suffering would not end as a mere cautionary tale. He declared that my victory tonight was going to become a permanent, unbreakable lifeline for thousands of other women fighting the exact same desperate battle. Dominic took a deep breath, his eyes shining with profound admiration as he looked back at me. He raised his voice, ensuring it reached the furthest corners of the grand ballroom. He officially announced the immediate establishment of a massive $10 million charitable foundation, fully funded by his venture capital firm, created exclusively in my name. He stated that the Olivia Wilson Foundation would be dedicated entirely to providing world-class free forensic accounting and elite legal aid to women who were trapped in financially abusive marriages. He promised that the foundation would hunt down hidden offshore accounts, expose fraudulent corporate ledgers, and completely dismantle the financial safety nets of abusive men, just like Bradley and Kendrick. He declared that no woman would ever have to face the terrifying prospect of losing everything simply because she chose to walk away from a toxic, manipulative partner. The sheer magnitude of the announcement hung in the air for a fraction of a second. Then a single person started clapping. It was my cousin, the bride, standing proudly near the shattered ice sculpture. Within seconds, the entire crowd erupted into a deafening, thunderous roar of genuine, unrestrained applause. The room shook triumphantly. The deafening applause finally subsided, leaving a heavy tension. The guests were now captivated by the shift in power. Dominic stood beside me while federal agents dragged Bradley's corrupt associates out the double doors. Amidst this destruction, my mother Patricia frantically scrambled to salvage the only thing she ever truly loved. She darted across the polished hardwood floor, smoothing her designer gown as she desperately approached a tight cluster of the most influential country club wives in Boston. These women dictated the social hierarchy, and Patricia was terrified of losing her coveted seat at their table. She forced a bright, brittle laugh that cracked under the immense pressure of the room. She reached out, attempting to grasp the arm of a wealthy senator's wife, desperate to weave her usual web of deceit. Patricia plastered a manic smile and spoke with a lightness. She waved her hand dismissively toward the stage, proclaiming that the evening was simply a misunderstanding. She begged her wealthy peers to ignore the federal arrests and revelations, insisting that Richard had everything under control. Then she turned her focus onto me. Patricia played the victim. She told the surrounding socialites that I was an unstable, cruel child prone to mental breakdowns. She claimed I was fabricating these lies out of jealousy because I could not handle seeing my family succeed. She painted herself as a tragic, long-suffering mother who had sacrificed everything to raise a terrible daughter. She laughed again, a high and desperate sound asking her wealthy friends to simply excuse my pathetic cry for attention. I did not raise my voice. I stepped away from Dominic and walked across the dance floor. The crowd immediately parted for me, creating a path to my mother. The heavy silence returned thicker and more suffocating than before, as everyone watched my approach. Patricia's brittle laughter died in her throat when I stopped. I did not scream. I looked at her with a calm that made her take a step backward. I told her I was going to command everyone's attention, but it would not be a cry for help. It would be a reckoning. I kept my voice level, the quiet intensity forcing the socialites to lean in closer to hear the destruction of Patricia's facade. I looked into her eyes and began to dismantle her life. I asked Patricia if she wanted to discuss her maternal sacrifices in front of her friends. I reminded her of the winter I was 17 when I spent 3 days in the hospital. I stated with crystal clear precision that she had refused to sit by my hospital bed because the annual winter gala was that weekend. I recalled how she had complained to the nursing staff that my illness was an inconvenience to her calendar. I watched the senator's wife recoil from Patricia. I reminded my mother of the day my acceptance letter to a design program arrived in the mail. I detailed how she had hidden the letter and refused to sign my student loans, claiming the family was broke. Meanwhile, she had spent $50,000 on a sports car the next morning to impress the women standing around us. Patricia began to tremble violently, her face draining of color. She opened her mouth to interrupt to spin another lie, but the sheer authority in my gaze silenced her. I told her that every choice she had ever made was rooted in vanity. She had watched Bradley destroy me for years because his wealth elevated her social standing. She had participated in my financial ruin, willing to let me starve in an apartment as long as she could continue attending luncheons. I stated that she had traded her daughter for designer handbags, country club memberships, and the approval of people who did not care about her. I raised my voice so every person in the ballroom heard my verdict. I announced that the illusion was over. I told her that Richard's accounts were frozen, Bradley was heading to federal prison, and her family trust fund was empty. I informed Patricia that she was completely irrevocably broke. I declared that there would be no more luxury vacations, no more catered galas, and no more hiding behind a wall of stolen money. The revelation hit the gathered socialites like a shockwave. The women Patricia had spent decades grooming exchanged glances. In their ruthless world, poverty was the ultimate unforgivable sin, and association with a bankrupt federal criminal was social suicide. Patricia turned to the senator's wife, her hands outstretched in a plea for validation. She begged her friends to speak up to defend their relationships, to assure her that they would have their tennis matches. The senator's wife looked at Patricia with an expression of disgust. She did not say a word. She gathered her silk wrap, turned her back on my mother, and walked away. One by one, the rest of the highly judgmental elites followed suit. They did not offer any sympathy, and they certainly did not offer any help. They turned their backs with brutal, synchronized precision, entirely cutting Patricia out of their elite circle. They murmured amongst themselves about the utter disgrace, actively distancing themselves from the toxic wreckage of my family. Patricia spun around in a wild, breathless panic, her expensive heels slipping on the floor. She reached out for anyone crying out names, begging for a person to look at her. Everyone simply looked away. The terrifying isolation was completely absolute. She was systematically stripped of her fake wealth, her stolen status, and her entirely fabricated identity. Patricia stood completely alone in the very center of the cold, massive ballroom, shivering violently in the harsh, cold reality of her permanent ruin. I turned my back and walked away from her pathetic, echoing, sobbing feeling, the smooth, incredibly heavy USB drive resting very securely inside my palm. The dark past was finally dead, and I still had a massive corrupt empire to finish dismantling. I pushed through the heavy oak double doors of the grand ballroom, leaving the suffocating atmosphere of shattered legacies behind me. The cool night air hit my face, a sharp contrast to the stifling heat of Patricia's collapsing social circle. My fingers remained tightly curled around the encrypted flash drive in my pocket. The gravel driveway of the elite country club was transformed into a chaotic, strobing spectacle. Several federal vehicles, with their red and blue lights flashing, were parked aggressively across the perfectly manicured entrance. I stood on the top step of the grand portico and watched the final act of my former husband's spectacular downfall unfold. Bradley and Kendrick were being marched down the wide stone steps by a team of stern-faced federal agents. The heavy metal handcuffs glinted sharply under the harsh glare of the police lights. Bradley stumbled his expensive tailored tuxedo, now looking like a crumpled, ill-fitting costume. He desperately tried to shield his face with his bound hands, ducking his head to avoid the blinding explosion of camera flashes. I had personally instructed my public relations team to anonymously tip off every major news outlet, financial journalist, and local gossip blog in the area. They had descended upon the country club like a swarm of hungry locusts armed with high-definition cameras and boom microphones. Reporters shouted relentless, piercing questions at the disgraced executives. They demanded comments on the wire fraud allegations, the offshore accounts, and the total collapse of their venture capital firm. Kendrick did not even try to hide. His face was a mask of hollow, broken defeat. His knees buckled slightly as an agent shoved him forward toward a waiting black SUV. Bradley glanced wildly around the crowd, his eyes wide with the panicked realization that his pristine, untouchable reputation was permanently annihilated. For a split second, his panicked gaze locked onto mine as I stood elevated on the portico. I did not smile. I simply stared back with a cold, unyielding certainty. He looked away instantly, his spirit entirely crushed before an agent pushed his head down and forced him into the back of the federal cruiser. The heavy doors slammed shut with a definitive echoing thud sealing their fates. I watched the convoy of government vehicles pull away their sirens, cutting through the crisp night air as they vanished down the long, winding driveway. The press corps immediately began doing live stand-up reports right on the country club lawn, broadcasting the financial scandal of the decade to the entire world. Dominic materialized beside me, his presence a quiet, reassuring anchor amidst the swirling media circus. He gave me a brief approving nod, silently acknowledging that our meticulously planned operation was a complete success. I exhaled a long, steady breath, feeling the crushing weight of the past 5 years finally lift from my shoulders. The war was officially over. Then I heard the heavy rustle of silk dragging across the stone patio. I turned to see Diana emerging from the shadows of the club entrance. My cousin was still wearing her elaborate couture wedding gown, but the glamorous illusion was entirely gone. The adrenaline that had fueled her spectacular public takedown of our toxic family had clearly evaporated, leaving behind a profound, trembling exhaustion. She looked incredibly small standing there under the grand archway. Her elaborate bridal updo had begun to unravel, and dark streaks of mascara stained her pale cheeks. She wrapped her arms tightly around her waist, shivering in the cool night air. Diana took a hesitant step toward me, her tough exterior shattering completely. The tears she had withheld inside the ballroom now flowed freely, spilling over her eyelashes and dropping onto the intricate lace bodice of her ruined dress. She had bravely sacrificed her own wedding day, her reputation, and her entire comfort zone to orchestrate this massive reckoning. Now she was facing the terrifying, vast unknown of a life entirely detached from the family-corrupted wealth. She stopped a few feet away from me, her chest heaving with deep, ragged sobs. She looked at me with wide, desperate eyes seeking a lifeline. She asked if she could stay with me, her voice trembling with vulnerability. She confessed that she had absolutely nowhere else to go, no money of her own, and no idea how to survive outside the gilded cage our family had built. Diana reached out her trembling fingers, hovering in the space between us. She pleaded for a spare room, a couch, or just a temporary place to hide, while the media storm raged and the legal fallout consumed her parents. She promised she would not be a burden. My heart ached for her. I knew the exact suffocating terror of standing on the edge of a ruined life with zero financial security. I had lived that nightmare when Bradley threw me out. I understood her desperate instinct to seek shelter, to find a new protector to replace the ones she had just bravely destroyed. I stepped forward and gently caught her trembling hands, lowering them slowly. I looked directly into her tear-filled eyes, ensuring she heard exactly what I was about to say. I told her to stop crying. I kept my voice incredibly calm but absolutely unyielding. I stated that I was immensely proud of the courage she displayed tonight, but I was not going to let her trade one form of dependency for another. I delivered the hard truth with uncompromising clarity. I told her that I will personally pay for the absolute best, most ruthless divorce lawyer in the entire state to guarantee she walks away from this fraudulent marriage completely free and legally protected. "But you are not moving into my house," I stated. "Providing a comfortable place to hide will stunt your growth. You need to learn to stand on your own 2 feet, just like I did." Diana stared, absorbing the tough love. She squared her shoulders, giving a slow, determined nod. Diana turned and walked back toward the shadows of the country club, her posture remarkably straighter despite the ruined wedding gown. I watched her disappear into the lingering fog of the evening, knowing the brutal reality she was about to face would ultimately forge her into something unbreakable. The grand portico was nearly deserted now. The chaotic swarm of federal agents, the flashing strobe lights, and the screaming journalists had all moved down the driveway, chasing the transport vehicles that carried Bradley and his corrupt empire away in handcuffs. The valet attendants were frantically trying to clear the massive backlog of luxury vehicles as the remaining high society guests fled the scene of the scandal. Dominic stood quietly beside me, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his tailored trousers. He did not rush me. He understood that tonight was the culmination of 6 agonizing years of survival, and I needed to absorb every single second of the aftermath. I took a deep, cleansing breath of the crisp night air, feeling a profound sense of absolute peace settle over my shoulders. The suffocating weight of my family's relentless expectations and Bradley's financial terrorism was finally gone. I was entirely free. We began walking slowly down the sweeping stone steps toward the valet stand, the sharp click of my heels echoing against the pavement. The once vibrant, bustling country club now felt like an abandoned movie set. The pristine illusion of wealth and power had been violently stripped away, leaving behind nothing but empty champagne flutes and discarded reputations. As we approached the designated pickup area, a pathetic, shivering figure caught my eye. Sitting directly on the dirty concrete curb, right next to a puddle of spilled valet water, was Natalie. Her custom beaded designer gown, which she had proudly flaunted just hours earlier in the ballroom, was now torn at the hem and stained with mud. She had lost one of her diamond earrings, and her meticulously styled hair hung in limp, defeated strands around her tear-streaked face. She was aggressively jabbing her fingers against the cracked screen of her smartphone, her chest heaving with frantic, desperate sobs. I paused, putting a gentle hand on Dominic's arm to stop our forward momentum. The gleaming black Maybach was already idling a few yards away, its tinted windows offering a silent promise of warmth and departure. But I could not simply walk past this specific wreckage. Natalie had been Bradley's most enthusiastic accomplice, the golden girl who had gleefully helped him hide assets and mock my poverty when I was starving in that tiny studio apartment. She had worn my stolen jewelry paraded around in my former home, and laughed the loudest when my father called me a pathetic failure. Now she was sitting in the dirt, completely abandoned by the very society she had sold her soul to impress. I watched her frantically press the phone to her ear, listening to the agonizing silence of a disconnected line. Her credit cards were frozen. Her bank accounts were seized in the federal raid. The luxury lifestyle she had violently stolen was instantly evaporated into thin air. She ripped the phone away from her ear and threw it onto the concrete with a frustrated, agonizing wail. It shattered into a dozen pieces, perfectly mirroring the current state of her completely ruined life. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently as the absolute terror of sudden, crushing poverty finally set in. Dominic watched her with a cold, analytical detachment, completely unmoved by her spectacular downfall. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the curb. My shadow fell over her shivering form, blocking the harsh glare of the security lights. Natalie slowly looked up, her bloodshot eyes widening in absolute horror when she realized who was standing over her. She scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the rough concrete, but she was trapped between the curb and a massive stone planter. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg, or perhaps to hurl one last desperate insult, but no words came out. The sheer magnitude of her defeat had robbed her of her voice. I looked down at her, feeling absolutely no pity, no anger, and no vindictiveness. I felt nothing but a cold, clinical closure. I reached into my elegant evening clutch and slowly unclasped the silver latch. My fingers brushed past my keys and my own phone, finding exactly what I was looking for. I pulled out a single, perfectly crisp $100 bill. I held it between my fingers, letting the cold wind catch the edge of the paper, so it fluttered slightly in the tense silence. Natalie stared at the money, her jaw trembling, as she tried to process what was happening. I looked at the crumpled, defeated woman cowering on the pavement and allowed a vivid memory to wash over me. 6 years ago, I was the one standing on a freezing sidewalk, clutching a garbage bag full of my belongings, while Bradley sneered at me from the doorway of our penthouse. He had tossed a crumpled bill onto the wet pavement with a look of supreme disgust. I let the crisp $100 bill slip from my fingers. It fluttered gracefully through the cold night air, landing gently in the muddy puddle right at Natalie's expensive, ruined shoes. I looked her dead in the eye, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any warmth. "For the Uber," I said, the exact words Bradley had used to dismiss my entire existence. The brutal poetry of the moment hit Natalie with the force of a physical blow. She let out a loud, agonizing wail of pure, unadulterated humiliation, shrinking away from the money as if it were on fire. I did not wait to see if she ever picked it up. I turned my back on her. Weeping form took Dominic's offered arm and stepped into the waiting Maybach, leaving the wreckage behind. The crisp night air felt magnificent against my skin as Dominic and I walked away from the miserable echoing wails of the woman who had once tormented me. Natalie remained curled on the dirty concrete, staring at the crumpled $100 bill resting in the muddy puddle, completely paralyzed by the poetic brutality of her own ruin. I did not look back. I slipped my hand securely into the crook of Dominic's arm, feeling the solid, reassuring warmth of his presence. His steady gait perfectly matched mine, grounding me in the triumphant reality of our shared victory. We moved smoothly across the manicured gravel driveway, putting distance between ourselves and the spectacular destruction of the people who had tried to break me. The scene surrounding the elite country club was a chaotic, strobing canvas of red and blue police lights, frantically scrambling valets and weeping socialites. Federal agents continued to secure the perimeter, barking orders over the frantic din of the local press corps. Journalists shouted rapid-fire questions, their camera flashes illuminating the tear-stained faces of the city's former elite. It was a masterpiece of total devastation. My mother was still inside, entirely isolated and socially executed by her wealthy peers, weeping over her vanished status. Bradley and Kendrick were already locked in the back of federal transport vehicles, facing decades in a federal penitentiary. The fraudulent empire that had governed my childhood and destroyed my first marriage was nothing but smoking rubble. Yet as we walked through the very center of this swirling, screaming chaos, a profound and unshakable peace enveloped me. It was a quiet, invincible serenity that sharply contrasted with the frantic, terrified energy radiating from the shattered relatives left behind. They were losing everything they valued because their entire identities were built on stolen money, shallow vanity, and ruthless deceit. I had lost everything 6 years ago, but I had rebuilt my life on a foundation of genuine grit, uncompromising integrity, and unwavering love. The flashing lights and screaming sirens did not touch the sacred space Dominic and I occupied. We were stepping out of the darkness and into a bright future we had forged with our own hands. A sleek black Maybach waited for us at the end of the circular driveway, idling quietly just beyond the reach of the frantic journalists. Its dark-tinted windows and polished exterior offered a beautiful sanctuary from the madness. As we approached the vehicle, a sudden, desperate shout tore through the crisp night air. It was a hoarse, ragged sound that lacked any of its former booming authority. I paused, my hand tightening slightly on the sleeve of Dominic's tailored jacket, and turned my head slowly toward the disruptive noise. Richard was sprinting across the loose gravel driveway, his expensive tuxedo jacket flapping wildly in the cold wind. The man who had spent my entire life barking cruel orders, dictating my worth and valuing absolute control, was now stumbling frantically toward us like a terrified, broken beggar. His face was flushed a deep, unhealthy red, and heavy sweat beaded on his wrinkled forehead. He had just watched his daughter orchestrate the total annihilation of his primary financial benefactors. He knew his secret ledgers were in the hands of federal prosecutors. He knew his country club kingdom was completely gone forever. He shouted my name again, his voice cracking with sheer desperation, begging me to wait, begging for a single moment to explain, pleading for the impossible mercy he had so casually denied me for my entire existence. Richard stretched out a violently shaking hand, desperately trying to close the remaining distance between us. He never made it. Before he could get within 10 feet of the waiting Maybach, Dominic's elite private security detail intercepted him with effortless, terrifying precision. Two massive men in tailored dark suits materialized instantly from the surrounding shadows, stepping smoothly into Richard's path. They did not shout. They did not draw any weapons. They simply formed an impenetrable human wall. Richard crashed directly into the lead guard, bouncing off the man's solid chest like a fragile hollow shell. The guard caught Richard by the shoulders, halting his frantic forward momentum instantly and holding him firmly in place. Richard struggled weakly against the guard's iron grip, his expensive leather shoes slipping uselessly on the loose gravel. He looked incredibly pathetic, a former tyrant reduced to a weeping, powerless old man. He looked past the massive shoulders of the security detail, his eyes locking onto mine with a sickening mix of terror and pleading recognition. He begged me to call off the lawyers, frantically insisting that we were family, crying out that he had only ever wanted the absolute best for me. He promised he could change, offering empty apologies that dissolved instantly into the chaotic night air. Dominic did not even blink. He looked at Richard with an expression of pure, icy indifference, completely unmoved by the frantic display of a broken abuser. Dominic smoothly guided me past the struggling, shouting man, shielding me entirely from the toxic desperation radiating from my father. One of the security guards swiftly opened the heavy rear door of the Maybach, waiting with respectful silence as Dominic handed me gracefully inside. I slid into the luxurious, beautifully illuminated cabin, instantly enveloped by the rich scent of leather and the warm, quiet sanctuary of our private world. Dominic climbed in immediately behind me, and the heavy door pulled shut with a soft, definitive thud. The thick, soundproof glass instantly severed the chaotic noise of the outside world. The screaming reporters, the blaring police sirens, and Richard's frantic, muffled begging vanished completely. Inside the car, the silence was beautiful and absolute. I let out a slow, calming breath, sinking deeply into the plush leather seat. Beside me, secured safely in his leather car seat, was little Leo. He was wearing a tiny, immaculate tuxedo, holding a small plush bear, and looking perfectly content. His wide, innocent eyes blinked curiously in the soft, ambient lighting of the peaceful cabin. As the Maybach smoothly pulled away from the curb, leaving the ruined country club and my destroyed family far behind. Forever, Leo pressed his small hands against the tinted glass. He peered out the thick window, watching the frantic, flashing police lights and the angry, crying figures fading quickly into the distance. He turned his head, his small brow furrowed in genuine, innocent confusion. He looked up at me and asked, "Mommy, why were those people so loud?" I felt a brilliant, overwhelming surge of love fill my chest. I smiled a genuine, radiant smile and reached over to gently kiss the top of his head. I looked down at my beautiful, perfect son, the absolute greatest achievement of my entire life, and softly replied, "Because empty things make the most noise, baby." Sunlight streamed through the massive glass windows of my corner office, casting sharp shadows across the mahogany floor. The space was a testament to everything I built from scratch. There were no inherited antiques, no borrowed art, and no traces of the Preston legacy. Every piece of sleek furniture represented my relentless survival. I stood near the glass watching cars navigate the downtown streets below. The screaming madness of the country club felt like a distant nightmare. Here there was only pristine silence and unyielding control. The intercom chimed. My assistant Maya stepped through the glass doors. She was fiercely intelligent, hungry for success, and immune to intimidation. She carried a thick manila folder in her hands, secured with official red tape. She did not speak as she crossed the room, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood. Maya placed the heavy file in the center of my immaculate desk. She gave a single professional nod, her eyes reflecting quiet respect, before retreating into the reception area. The doors sealed shut behind her. I walked over to the desk, the smooth fabric of my tailored suit shifting around me. I reached out and rested my fingertips against the rough paper. I did not feel the intoxicating rush of vindictive adrenaline I had anticipated for 6 years. Instead, I felt a profound stillness. I flipped the cover open, exposing the white legal documents inside. The first pages were the finalized federal indictments and bankruptcy declarations for Bradley and Kendrick. Their offshore accounts were frozen, their luxury assets seized, and their futures permanently confined to a federal penitentiary. The men who laughed while I starved were now legally, financially, and socially annihilated. I turned the page. The next documents detailed the absolute ruin of my parents. The foreclosure on the imposing colonial mansion was fully executed. The sprawling estate where my mother curated her vicious social hierarchies and my father demanded blind obedience no longer belonged to them. Their bank accounts were drained by massive legal fees and outstanding debts. They were being evicted today, forced to pack whatever meager belongings the federal auditors allowed them to keep. Their elite social circles had entirely blacklisted them. They were finally bankrupt. I stared at the black ink tracing the official government stamps and binding signatures of federal judges. This was the definitive legal death of my toxic past. Every person who actively participated in my destruction, who mocked my poverty, who manipulated my loyalty, was now facing the brutal reality of their own actions. The empire of lies was reduced to formal paperwork on my desk. I expected to feel a desperate urge to frame these documents to keep them as a glowing trophy of my victory. I thought I would want to read every single word, savoring the microscopic details of their spectacular downfall. But as I looked at the names printed on the pages, I realized they held absolutely no power over me anymore. They were simply names. The intense hatred and burning anger that fueled my initial rise from the ashes had burned out, replaced by a cool indifference. I picked up the heavy stack of documents. The paper felt thick and substantial in my hands. I walked over to the sleek industrial shredder positioned discreetly near the corner of the room. I did not gloat or offer a triumphant monologue to the empty space. I simply pressed the power button. The machine hummed to life with a quiet, efficient purr. I fed the first bankruptcy filing into the narrow slot. The sharp steel blades caught the paper, instantly pulling it down and grinding it into thousands of meaningless strips. I fed the federal indictments next, watching Bradley's name vanish into the churning metal. Finally, I dropped the foreclosure notices and my parents' financial ruin into the machine. The shredder whirred steadily, obliterating the last physical evidence of the people who tried to erase me. When the final page disappeared, I turned the machine off. The silence returned, thicker and more beautiful than before. I walked over to the elegant coffee station near the bookshelf. I poured a fresh cup of dark, rich coffee, the bitter, comforting aroma filling the air around me. I took a slow sip, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. I carried the porcelain cup back to my desk and sat down in the tall leather chair. I reached across the polished surface and pulled a brand new, pristine white file toward me. I opened it to reveal the details of my next client. She was a young, brilliant software developer whose partners were trying to force her out of her own startup. She was terrified, overwhelmed, and surrounded by manipulative predators. She needed someone who understood the battlefield, someone who could dismantle her enemies and secure her absolute freedom. She needed saving. I picked up my silver pen, the metal cool against my skin. I wrote my name at the top of her strategy document, making a silent promise that she would not be crushed. I had built my empire on the ruins of my own suffering, and now I was going to use that immense power to shield others from the same darkness. I stood up holding my coffee and walked back to the massive wall of windows. The morning sun bathed the metropolis in a golden glow. The city stretched out before me, an endless landscape of towering skyscrapers, winding rivers, and infinite potential. It was a world I had fought tooth and nail to conquer, a world that now bowed respectfully to my absolute authority. I took another breath, feeling the electric pulse of total freedom coursing through my veins. The past was ground into dust. The future was a blank, beautiful canvas waiting for my command. I looked out over the glittering skyline, a subtle, genuine smile finally touching my lips. The camera slowly pulls back, drifting through the glass, leaving me standing victorious above the world. End of script.